I want to share with you my experience with embedded journalism. In this case, when aid agencies embed journalists. And I want to discuss with you humanitarian reporting. Why should we care? It will be more than ever in the future essential, I believe, because conflicts have consequences in an interconnected world. It's foreign news about us. The internet has shrunk the world. We now get pictures of despair instantly through diverse media channels and hear unmediated voices from chaotic situations. There are flows of people around the world following many of these catastrophes, and those who arrived in previous waves, they will influence a country towards reporting and contributing to the rescue of those affected. I was in the biggest camp for Syrian refugees in Zaatari, in Jordan, 12 kilometers away from the Syrian border. The camp holds more than 80,000 people who fled the war in Syria. I went to Syria because I wanted to the Syrian border because I wanted to record a documentary for Austrian and German public radio, where I wanted to find out how everyday life is organized in a refugee camp. I used the UNHCR handbook, the handbook by the UN Agency for Refugees, as a reference point and compared it with the reality on the ground. There are two inescapable points when you arrive in Zaatari as journalist. Firstly, you are in a conflict zone. The war is physically and psychologically very close. People hear the war, especially at night. And the memories of the war are very present, like in the case of a woman called Manal, who I met in the camp, and I want to play you what she says.
It was difficult to go to the shelter.
Es war schwierig, in die Schutzräume zu gehen. Es war kalt, es war Winter.
And there's no food.
Und es gab nichts zu essen.
You just hold your children and go to the shelter.
Du hältst nur deine Kinder im Arm und suchst Schutz. Aber die Unterkunft ist nicht sicher.
Small place.
Es ist nur ein kleiner Ort, wo man sich verstecken kann.
Inside it. And you can see more than 200
Manchmal sind wir mehr als 200 Leute.
Sometimes it's about 500.
Manchmal sogar um die 500.
We just hide in this shelter and it's not safe.
And the second inescapable point is you are embedded with the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, who run the camp, and with other UN agencies and NGOs who implement programs in the camp. Free movement is very difficult. Security concerns dictated that I was only allowed to be in the camp between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. And secondly, because of the control the UN imposes on the information journalists release. I saw media organizations visiting the camp for 1-2 days, accompanied the whole time by UNICEF, who showed them schools and kindergartens. When you are embedded, to look left and right is very difficult, is hardly impossible in this time. A critical reflection or interview with the refugees in the camp is not possible. There are deep concerns from aid agencies about which stories are told. Why? We need to keep in mind that aid works takes place in a competitive compassion market. Aid agencies are fighting each other for donations and therefore media coverage, positive media coverage. And in order to remain on the fast-moving media carousel, aid agencies run high visibility campaigns to attract public awareness, especially after disasters. For instance, Haiti, in the aftermath of the earthquake in 2010, it disappeared in a sea of flags and organization logos. And this competitive compassion market leads to a lack of transparency and, in consequence, a false picture of the disaster is being shown. Aid agencies tend to exaggerate at two stages while communicating from a disaster, in both cases to attract donors. At the beginning, about the dimension of the disaster, and then about the agency having everything under control. The main message from aid agencies to donors remains from the first moment on that your aid is reaching the vulnerable, neglecting the struggle to achieve it. Those involved in the aid sector are very aware of these tensions, but still many hesitate to admit it publicly because it goes against the charitable nature of an aid organization to compete in a highly competitive market. Journalists very often support this false picture because, firstly, in the rush of an emergency, they need easy access to stories, and secondly, being embedded allows access to easy stories. I did not contact any aid agencies before going to Zaatari to avoid being embedded, except the UN, of course, because I needed the entry permit from them. Kilian Kleinschmidt, the UNHCR camp manager, you can see him here in a picture with Abu Wael, one of the clan leaders in the camp. Kilian Kleinschmidt was unusually transparent about his job and the work done by the UN. The contact with Kleinschmidt came through Facebook, by the way, and not the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. If I had done it, I think I still would wait for my permit. In the camp, I spontaneously talked to Oxfam, the Norwegian Refugee Council, or World Food Programme, and they all made clear that they needed the recordings before broadcast. UNICEF blocked any unscheduled visits inside the camp, saying it was only possible via the press department in Amman. I heard the most mind-blowing comments from both UN aid agencies and NGOs about the difficulties of giving aid, logistically, financially, and in terms of competition. But all of the records. The moments are very rare when you get a glimpse of a more realistic picture of coordinating aid under extreme circumstances. Let's listen to a debate between UNHCR, Kilian Kleinschmidt, and his colleague from UNICEF during their weekly coordination meeting. There are no subtitles here because it's unedited material, and so it's in English.
I mean, first of all, you're basically saying that we don't do our job now. Put it on record, please.
I didn't say that.
You said that camp management doesn't work.
No, I said that if you think that there is a poor management of water,
then it's because camp management doesn't work.
No, it's because it's a common responsibility of everybody.
Okay, then be also careful. I mean, we're all throwing things in here, they're recorded. So we record now that the camp management is poor. Now, number one, yes, we recognize camp management is poor, the police is not doing the job, and UNHCR is not doing the job.
I do not accept that. And I'm sorry, I request the intersectoral working group, the coordinator that is here, to record what is the attitude of the coordination. Because if that is the attitude, we are not going anywhere, and they're not even available to discuss. I didn't say that the police is not working here.
Okay, no, but please, Lucio, you have put in right now an element of, well, okay, we're recognizing that the minutes should be amended.
Yeah.
There's no need to get angry. If I take what you just said by the word, I will request to put this in a minute. That is what I'm saying. This is not the style we have been using here before. Thank you.
We have reached a very critical point about reporting from disaster and conflict zones. It is very well established that foreign news reporting is facing turbulent times. So who will cover the emergencies in the future? In the last years, aid agencies have become smarter, turning themselves into reporter for the mainstream media, providing, for instance, footage, video footage, audio files, articles, and aid worker diaries. They operate as co-producers, embedding reporters in the disaster field. It is a complicating factor when aid agencies become content providers because it raises questions of reliability and accuracy. Can we always be sure who is speaking to us? I wrote this article for an Austrian newspaper on the food crisis in Niger in 2005. But I was not writing as a journalist. I was there as an aid worker, which the newspaper didn't mention. They were happy to receive a gratis report from the aid agency. The internet and its social media channels have partly changed the humanitarian reporting picture. I'm convinced that networked societies are more likely to gain attention during emergencies in future thanks to user-generated content on channels like WhatsApp and Twitter from eyewitness or voices of those directly affected. Journalists are not longer the gatekeepers of information, and aid agencies don't need traditional media anymore to get the information out. We can do it ourselves, said the head of communication from World Food Programme in London to me recently. We don't need people like Monica anymore. What do they do instead? The following graphic illustrates you very well the goal of non-profit storytelling. You can see on the left-hand side what the primary storytelling goals are from the perspective of an aid agencies. It's about fundraising, awareness, and advocacy. But are they self-satisfied about what they do? Not so much, this survey suggests. It's 23% are satisfied with the quantity, 39% are satisfied with the quality. This is a survey the Georgetown's University Center for Social Impact Communication did with 80 non-profit organizations. So what the head of communication from World Food Programme wanted to say is that through social media channels, they bring stories about impact of funds to their donors. So that's their story and nothing else. What the internet has not changed is the quality of the relationship between aid workers and journalists. There is a high level of frustration on both sides. The coverage of the famine in East Africa in 2011, including the conditions in the biggest refugee camp, Dadaab, at the Somalian-Kenyan border, is representative for an ongoing dilemma when it comes to communicating disasters, the portrayal of suffering. Here you can see how two big media organizations covered the famine in East Africa before the situation was widely known. This is a screenshot from a film done by the BBC. And here you see the cover of the New York Times. Have we learned anything since the 1980s? That is the subject of research by the International Broadcasting Trust, in which media and NGOs reflect on coverage of the East African famine in 2011. And the tone and context suggest that little has changed since the famine in Ethiopia 30 years ago. Simplistic and stereotyped pictures say the aid workers, reluctant to address some of the more difficult problems of operating in conflict zones, say the journalists. Aid agencies still use, indeed, very easy language to communicate the complexity of the situation. You give your 30 euros and suddenly those people in need are going to have food for at least a month. Journalists very often rehash this language by reporting on an emergency from the perspective of a white aid worker and her and his effort in reaching the distant sufferer, with no time or space to question the how. Only later do the media focus on what went wrong, confronting the audience with often very sharp and polemical criticism of aid agencies. Neither of these two extremes helps to understand the complex realities on the ground. What is needed? Transparency in the communication of those giving aid would allow a relationship of trust and credibility with the audience to build. It would lead to the public being treated like adults. And, just as important, it would reduce unrealistic expectations of giving aid. It would allow agencies to show a realistic picture of the everyday ups and downs in the field instead of the glossy pictures. It avoids media portraits of aid angels in their self-sacrificing efforts to assist the victims. What surprises me in communicating disasters is that local media voices are still rarely heard. Given that it has become so fashionable for aid agencies to say they work with local partners, there's still very little attention paid to local media, which play a key part in informing the local population in the aftermath of a disaster. This exclusion of local media manifests itself in very, very basic ways. To give you an example from a colleague, a journalist who was in Haiti, where they worked after the earthquake with NGOs and UN together to coordinate the aid. And at the meetings where they coordinated the aid, these meetings were all in English. There was not a single Creole translator, nor even a French translation. So how would the Haitian journalist know that the meetings are even happening? What is the reason for this situation? There is a phenomenon known as regionalizing global humanitarianism. This refers to a Western audience's desire to see people like them delivering aid. The aid workers in a disaster area must come from your own country because we give aid. And aid workers from the same organization but a different nationality is unsuitable for the back home where donors want to identify with the person in the field. And very often, to share the same nationality is not even enough for regional newspapers, which want to present an aid worker from the same region. Aid workers play this game of personalizing aid perfectly, having learned it from the media. Instead of reflecting the question, are we needed? Or might we simply duplicating resources in a crowded aid situation? 5 communicators from the same NGO line up to give the same messages to their respective home audiences. And what are the effects of this regionalization? When we see the world of disasters and human need through a national perspective that divides the category of global humanity into us and them, active saviors and passive victims, the part of local workers and survivors is minimized, and a Western-led and Western-centric view of humanitarianism is reinforced. It prevents establishing a relationship which goes beyond pity and stereotyped pictures of suffering, which both aid agencies and media still produce. I don't see a so-called compassion fatigue, but the public is tired of misery caused by the repetitive representation of suffering. Very often, humanitarian reporting sounds predictable. This situation could be changed through a new and grown-up relationship established by aid agencies and media in the way they communicate disasters and conflicts. It could lead to a compassion regard. I'm hugely interested in solutions journalism to show conflicts, but also how people overcome obstacles. But I don't like advocacy journalism because the complex and often more interesting reality gets lost. My documentary about Zaatari is a story about a refugee camp with the prospect to transform it into a city, with good reason, because the average time a person lives in a refugee camp is 17 years. There were promising results in Zaatari, but with the time, funds stopped arriving in Zaatari, and shortly before I left, Manal said the following to me.
Yesterday I asked someone to help us to get out from the camp, to live in a village.
Gestern habe ich jemanden gebeten, uns zu helfen. Wir wollen aus dem Lager raus und in einem Dorf leben.
I need a custody author.
Dazu brauche ich jemanden, der für uns haftet.
the life in the camp in winter is
Das Leben im Lager ist im Winter zu schwer.
so.
Wir wollen in ein Dorf oder in eine kleine Stadt gehen. Das wäre wunderbar für meine Töchter und meinen Sohn.
Small
Wir
city.
haben ständig Erkältungen und Allergien wegen des Staubs.
My husband says that he maybe stay here in the
Mein
camp.
Mann
work
sagte,
in
dass
the
er
camp.
vielleicht im Lager
Me
bleibt
and
und
the
arbeitet.
children go outside.
Die Kinder und ich gehen.
He can work
Hier
here.
kann er ja
He
arbeiten,
has,
aber außerhalb des
work.
Lagers
But, outside
hätte er
the camp,
möglicherweise
he cannot
Schwierigkeiten, einen Job zu finden.
find work. We discuss this
Wir
very
wollen
now.
unser Leben wieder in
Try
den
to
Griff
develop
bekommen.
the life. Maybe I found a work. If I found
Vielleicht
here
finde
a
ich ja
work
Arbeit
here,
im
maybe I
Lager.
stay. I try. Yes,
Wenn ja, dann werde ich versuchen zu bleiben.
we try. We must develop. It seems that it's long time.
Das Problem in
The
Syrien wird noch sehr lange andauern.
take long time.
Nicht nur ein
It's
oder
not just
2 Monate,
a month
wie wir
or so,
dachten.
like we thought.
Es kann Jahre
Maybe
dauern.
take years. We cannot live in a camp for years.
Wir können nicht jahrelang im Lager leben.
It's difficult.
This was shortly before many people started to flee the region last year, but that's another story. And I would like to thank you here for your attention and would like to use the next 30 minutes with you to discuss this issue and to debate what you think about humanitarian reporting and where we stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, for putting the light of this global issue. Your suggestion is in discuss with the group. So, how we start? We are waiting for the group. Something popping up.
Yes, I mean, I would like to hear whether you have similar experiences in your country that very often, from your perspective as a listener, as a reader, as a viewer, you have the impression that you don't know who is speaking to you when there is a humanitarian crisis. Do you think sometimes that you are overloaded by information from NGOs, or do you think it is...
I think the issues that you bring up are excellent, and one of the problems that came to mind is that a lot of us do get our news now from Facebook. You're getting these little reports, and the problem is that the general public, I think, is not used to, and it, because of electronic media, but also because of other reasons, not willing to take the time to read or watch an in-depth report about what are the causes of a conflict. And it's even, I was just cleaning out some files because I'm a very analog person and I still have file cabinets. And I noticed even 15 years ago, 20 years ago, newspaper reports were entire pages long with no photographs, or maybe just a small photograph. We're so inundated with information that we can hardly read those kind of things that people would read on a normal basis even 10, 15 years ago.
Anybody else?
Monica, do you think that local reporters have better access to the stories than a foreign correspondent?
It's a good question. Better access, I don't know. It depends on who the foreign reporter is. If it is a reporter who is based in the country where the emergency is happening, or if it is a foreign reporter who goes there only because of the emergency. If it's the first case, then it can be equal. But very often it is a language problem. And very often it is, what my experience is, it is underestimated. The importance of communication can be aid for the local population. And I think local reporters are better at it than foreign reporters, because foreign reporters, naturally, they need to report to their people at home.
It seems to me one of the problems, if I'm speaking for CBC, for example, which I'm not part of CBC anymore, but from the mindset of the foreign editor at CBC, they would naturally trust somebody who is in their employ as opposed to somebody who they don't know what their credentials, what their background, what their biases are. But at the same time, that local person may have access to stories that the person flying into the combat zone or the stress zone wouldn't have. And I guess the question is, how do you convince a faraway foreign editor to trust locals to tell the story?
I think that's a question of how you approach the subject you want to talk about. No, what are your contacts? No, who do you know to set it up? I mean, of course, it is a question of trust, but I think that's the same as we approach people who we want to interview. It's a question of a process where we start to find out, can we work with this person or not? I think very often the ideal situation would be that a local and an international reporter work together. That's a very ideal picture, which very often doesn't happen. Yeah, I understand why. Because very often, as you know, foreign reporters, once they are landed in the emergency situation, before even being there, they need to give the first impressions of the situation on the ground from the taxi in which they are. That happens very often.
Monica, over here. I just want to thank you very much. I thought it was really fascinating to hear. Very brief. And I'd love to hear more about your analysis of that. I make documentaries, but my day job is with an international media development agency, Internews. We train and work with... Oh, okay. Here I am. Is that better? So, we work with local journalists in disasters. We also work with them in stabilisation environments, and but I think it really resonated a lot. I've witnessed a lot of what you talk about, and the power of the local media to is really, I think, one area that needs to be built up in any disaster response. I think there's a sort of whole other debate around what has happened to aid agencies and their need to control their own message, and this sense of liability of not doing enough if that's exposed to the media, that then they'd be held responsible, God forbid. I guess I don't really have a question, except that I really appreciated to hear some analysis of that, because I sort of see it in my regular work day to day, and I think I completely agree about the public needing to be treated as adults, and if it makes you uncomfortable, then rather than have a guilt response, to have a sort of a mature sort of analysis of what is going wrong in the world if these sort of situations keep unfolding and we don't learn from, as you said, the drought that we all witnessed on the front pages of newspapers in the 1980s. We're still seeing it again and again. I just want to say thank you and appreciate that.
I mean, I showed you, thank you very much for your comment, I appreciate it a lot. I showed you this picture from the article I wrote 10 years ago. There have been changes. I don't see these kind of articles so much anymore, where a newspaper or a radio station or even a TV broadcaster wouldn't say somewhere who is the person who wrote it if it's not a journalist. I mean, it happened even on TV where there were MSF TV clips and they were not shown as MSF Médecins Sans Frontières video clips. But it is happening not as much as before. So this, for me, is a positive change.
Monica? Here, Lorelei. I'm not standing up, but thank you very much. I thought this was absolutely fascinating, and particularly the whole issue of the kind of compassion competition and the ways in which that is structured and that is reproduced, I found very interesting. But there are pragmatic problems when you do go into situations where the languages are different from yours, and those pragmatic problems affect journalists, local journalists in those situations, and their ability to speak internationally as much as they affect anything else. Like, for example, in the clip we heard of Manal, we're reading a script, we can hear the English original, but she's faded down in German because you need to reach an audience at home. What we find, and we can chart this through podcasts and so on, is that when we deal with international situations and disaster situations, there is a compassion fatigue. People actually turn off the radio. They turn off the radio partly because they can't bear the sound of foreign accents on the ear. And this we've charted very, very clearly. And I suppose my question to you is, how do we get around this problem, particularly if we're going into situations like this, we're meeting local journalists who, in a sense, can become partners in any project, any documentary project we might have, but who may not have the language of our language to a level that is sufficient for broadcast at home, so that, in a sense, we take their voice away from them in the process of producing the program, and we take it away on the basis of needing to get information across.
It's a very interesting point you're making, because I'm not sure whether people are turning off the radio because they hear voices in the background and then they hear the voice over. I mean, for us in German, it goes without saying that we need to do all these voiceovers because there are not so many countries where you can interview people worldwide in German. So I think our listeners are used to it, that there is not German spoken now to them. It is in a foreign language. From my perspective, we can talk about the compassion fatigue because of the repetitive imagery of suffering. It's nothing new. Why should you care? It looks so similar. And even more, you feel hopeless because you have the impression, oh, I can't do anything. And so if we changed a little bit the way we report about it and be more transparent, and if aid agencies allowed us to be more transparent, then I think we could gain again the attention of our audience to talk and report about the disasters. I think it is possible.
Monica, I have a question about another role of these aid organizations. You pointed out very well that their first aim is, of course, to show disasters, to make people feel compassion, to raise money, and, well, to survive as organizations too. I have this clear, and the strategy you pointed out, it was very clear for me. But I wanted to look on another side of these organizations, because I feel that they often are also interpreting conflicts. that they are also filtering the access of journalism, how they write about a conflict, about the Syrian conflict, because as not so many journalists go really into the country, to the ES area, nearly nobody goes, of course, for good reasons. There are few people who are really being available to get on the field. Most people get just to the camps, get their victims presented by help organizations. So my question is, how do you see this role of filtering, of making patterns, of complaining one side? Does it depend on from whom this help organization comes? Does a German or French organization has another focus as, let's say, a Russian? I don't know if there are. Is there a change? I remember that at first, of course, Assad was a bad guy. Then later, okay, ES is even maybe worse. And then what are the rebellions who are fighting with ES together in some parts? So what is the interpretation role of these help organizations, and how do you see the maybe arising problems with this when they filter the access of journalists on getting on the conflict?
Yeah, it's a very important point, because first of all, we cannot only talk about being embedded with an aid agency as a negative thing, because indeed there are moments where it would have been very dangerous for you as a journalist to move alone through certain areas in Dadaab or at the Syrian-Jordan borders. Yes, so then you need the embedding. If you need it, then again, what I have said before, it is very important that as a journalist, you say, like we are used to it with the military embedding, we cannot take in all sides in these reports because it is impossible. I think we should be very transparent about it, that it does not fulfill the full journalistic criteria because it is impossible. And then second point, I mean, those of you who follow Twitter, you might follow maybe MSFC, the media channel from Médecins Sans Frontières, who report on their rescue actions on the Mediterranean Sea. What they do it perfectly well. It is beautiful edited. It gives you a clear picture of what they do. I don't mind. I read it, and I know exactly who it is. So I know it's only their perspective. And then it is upon me, as a documentary maker, as a journalist, what do I do with this information? Because at the end of the day, it is upon us to use it then. And yes, it is a certain filter. But we, as journalists, also filter. What I simply expect is much more transparency, and not to be scared that transparency leads to less attention. We expect now so much from our listeners to be media savvy on social media channels, etc., etc. So I think we need to treat them like adults.
What do you mean about transparency? What do you mean about transparency?
Transparency to say clearly where the message comes from, to say clearly that you have been embedded. I understand that talking about agencies who do good, that we have a kind of approach where we say, well, if somebody does good, he is good. Not everything is good. And when I say we need to show the everyday ups and downs, it doesn't mean that I want to make a scandalous piece about corruption in Oxfam or whatever. No, it's simply showing these aid workers as human beings and not as aid angels. And this is very difficult because they are so dependent on donations. And many are worried that they then lose their people who donate for them. So one way to avoid it would be, for instance, to establish at least national umbrella organizations where money goes in, so that not each aid agency needs to fight for their donations. But again, I mean, I know we have it in Austria, I know Germany has it a little bit, I know Britain has this umbrella organization, but still, unfortunately, I see there is a lot of competition. So we could bring it to a wider umbrella, the UN, but that is a very, very, very complicated factor.
Hi, Tim Desmond from RT in Ireland. Thanks, Monica. Very interesting chat. My question, I guess, is about ownership of material. As journalists, we're permitted to own our material and also to own the editorial control. And notwithstanding the audience, which we do have to serve, and we serve as a cultural filter for what we're seeing and what we're witnessing. And I'm interested in your own case. You played us some material that you said wasn't broadcast, which was an interesting exchange. What can we do when we're in a situation, because inevitably we are compromised, you can't get to places without doing a deal with some organisation or another to get you there. What can we do to maintain more control of our material and more ownership of our material when we go into a situation like you've described?
Well, the very important first step is to remain as independent as possible, simply by not being financially dependent on the organization which maybe invites you to visit a refugee camp in Turkey or at the border between Syria or Jordan. I have witnessed that as soon as there is any financial implication in it, either it is a transport, I'm not talking about flight expenses, a simple transport, food, accommodation, it becomes very complicated to remain the critical distance to those who you work with, who you interview in this situation. That's why I felt so free, although I was embedded, because I was on my own in the camp. I had no permanent UNHCR press officer on my side. And that gave me the freedom to not depend on what they wanted to show me and not to record it, because there were simply no expectations. But I have made different experiences in Cambodia, where part of my trip was paid, and it was much more complicated than for me to ask the critical questions. I mean, I could ask them, but I knew I was in a way binded. Is that the right word? Binded? Yeah. Bound?
Compromised.
That's a word, yeah.
There is time for one more question.
I do not really have a question, but to make things even more complicated than they are already, I just wanted to mention that the aid organizations, they are also embedded. They are embedded, the big ones, they are quite often embedded, I think, into the politics of their countries. They do get funds not only from private donors, why they do embed journalists, but at the same time, quite often, I think they have to fulfill the needs of their official donors, like European Commission and foreign affairs ministries, and this makes the situation even worse for both sides. So when we are now trying to look at a solution or a kind of solution, it might be also quite helpful to talk to those big aid agencies and talk about embedded journalism and what are our needs and what are their needs, because they also quite often they are in a very tough situation, as far as I know.
Yeah, that's very clearly, and there are a lot of examples where you can see that the aid was not given to the people because they needed it, but because it fitted into a program. For many years, many years, one of the words which were in all the programs, more in development aid than in emergency aid, was gender. This is one thing. And the other thing, I think it can be avoided through by the international NGOs cooperating with local NGOs. This was the case of the 8 agencies I worked, that they only cooperated with local aid agencies. And that gave me really the belief, and I was convinced, so this is what is needed. And if it hadn't happened at one emergency, I would have left immediately.
Okay.
May I? I will not ask the question. I will just want to give compliments to your lecture, whatever it is it was called. And I think I share many people here that we are really pleased to heard what you have said to us. And I especially personally, I will carry with me this phrase for a long time, and this is compassion market. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luba. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Thank you a lot.